Hey, it's great to welcome the president of the St. Louis Cardinals, Bill DeWitt, to Questions for Cancer Research today. Bill, how are you?
I'm good, thanks.
It's amazing how quickly the time goes by. Spring training is upon us. Are your pitchers and catchers starting up today?
Yeah, everybody's sort of rolling in, and some guys were down there earlier. But yeah, it's that time of year. It's fun to mark that milestone and start thinking about warmer days ahead.
Yeah, I know it is. It is. It's an exciting time. We wish you and the Cardinal fans all the best this year. Um, Bill, the DeWitt family may be the longest tenured family in all of MLB, going back to your grandfather, who was the owner of the St. Louis Browns and the Cincinnati Reds. Can you tell us about your family's long, successful history in the game of baseball?
Sure, yeah. Well, you're right. My grandfather started in it, and uh, it just as a kid. I mean, he jumped into he was from North St. Louis City, and he jumped into the originally the Browns front office under Branch Rickey. He hired him as a just kind of an office boy at the time, and he was very young. And Branch Rickey took a liking to him, and he really started to develop in the game and get an interest in it. And so Rickey moved over to the Cardinals shortly after that first meeting, and so my grandfather was with the Cardinals actually for about I want to say about 20 years. Um, his and he helped Ricky develop the farm system. He ended up going to law school at night and ultimately became the treasurer. But he wore all sorts of hats back then during those Cardinal days. In fact, to show you how much things have grown and changed, he helped Dizzy Dean with his sponsorship contracts when that
No.
wasn't even a thing that agents did or anybody like that. It was just he was a front office person helping out one of the players.
Wow.
Um, and then he moved on to the Browns, like you said. He ended up putting together a group to buy the Browns in St. Louis, and of course they ultimately moved and became the Baltimore Orioles in the early '50s. And so my grandfather moved on to a role with MLB and then the Yankees as an assistant GM and then the Tigers as a general manager. And then ultimately he bought the Reds, was his big move in the early 60s. And he did that for 6 or 7 years. And that's why I grew up in Cincinnati, because my parents, who grew up in St. Louis as part of that earlier legacy with his baseball career, um, they moved to Cincinnati in the 60s. And when he sold the team, they just stayed there and raised our family. So then you get to the sort of uh, early 90s, and my father was looking to get back into the game because it was a passion of his from growing up and being a part of it. And when he put the group together to buy the Cardinals from Anheuser-Busch in 1996, it was really full circle for him, because it was the team he grew up loving. Um, and so kind of a dream come true for him. And I moved there at the time. I had just finished business school and started my career there and here. And this is my 30th season now with the Cardinals. So it's been a great run. And yeah, but the history goes all the way back, and it's been fun since I've moved back here. Um, these things tend to pop up like little reminders of my grandfather's time here. Somebody might share like a letter that he wrote on Cardinal stationery in the 30s, or things of that nature. So it's kind of been fun to reconnect with that history in my career here.
Yeah, that is really amazing. And I know that you received a great education beginning in prep school at Taft, where we overlapped for a year. You went on to Yale and then received your MBA from Harvard. Obviously, as you said, you grew up around the game. At what point did you realize that baseball was the best choice for you, or was there never ever a doubt?
Well, it was when my father put that group together. Actually, prior to the Cardinal deal, he had had some stints with a couple of other teams, including the Texas Rangers, where he partnered with George W. Bush and some other investors to buy the Rangers. And he put that deal together. Bush ended up being kind of the point person, and the rest is history, literally, on that one. But he flirted with the Orioles for a little bit in the early 90s, was putting a deal together, and then Peter Angelos kind of came in and and outbid him, but he was showing that interest in getting back in the game, and I was just sort of doing my thing, and of course loved sports and loved baseball, but I didn't grow up thinking that's what I would do, which I think was actually kind of healthy because, I was motivated to sort of find my own way. And then when it did happen, though, it was very exciting for me, and I ended up jumping in, and it's been a really cool thing to have done now for 30 years.
Yeah, no, it's a great family history and obviously a great family business to get involved with. Let's talk a little MLB. Let's start with pitching. Over the last 20 years or so, we've seen an increased focus on pitchers maxing out velocity and spin rate. This has seemingly led to a significant increase in injuries, and MLB has also seen a meaningful decline in the number of innings pitched by starting pitchers. I know that these are concerns to Commissioner Manfred. Do you recall any specific period in the last 15 to 20 years where the Cardinals organization recognized that the game was changing and a concerted effort was made to retrain pitchers to throw harder and maximize spin rate? Or did this just kind of naturally evolve with the game?
Yeah, I think it evolved. It didn't start with, all of a sudden this spring training, everybody's going to go max effort and that kind of thing. Um, it definitely was an evolution. And I think when, Tony La Russa was actually at the front end of that, with Oakland, he, sort of famously made Dennis Eckersley the ninth inning closer. And some teams had kind of flirted with that and done it a little bit, but for him, it was like, you're our guy, hell or high water, and it was very successful. And then he kind of created the rest of the bullpen around that peg, and carried that. The game was evolving to that level, and I think when he came to St. Louis, that continued. And certainly when the closer role started to develop like that, the idea of max effort was naturally part of that approach, because you were just going one inning or whatever. And then teams started realizing, well, if all of our pitchers do that, they're going to be probably a little bit more successful in any given inning. But then you've got, innings are um, a scarce resource to be able to provide for pitchers, and you only have so many innings in a pitcher's arm. So I think, pitcher rosters were increased at one point. I don't know exactly when, by a spot or two over time. And that allowed for people to max out even more. I'm not sure that was a great move. I mean, you understand why, right? Because it was kind of needed for recovery and more arms to handle the innings load. But, just it kept that pattern going. And so, and now, pitchers are evaluated on those things like strikeout rate and spin rate, and so it's just been a natural evolution with lots of different reasons for why it's evolved that way. But MLB, I know for a fact, is looking hard at, okay, it's evolved to that point. What can we do about it? Are there some rules changes we can discuss? Are there ways to perhaps make managers more reluctant to make a change, which would recalibrate pitchers to a more more innings of pitching, which, has a ripple effect in how they approach each batter. So there's discussions about that, but right now, no concrete solutions regarding a rules change to that issue.
Yeah, I've spoken to Commissioner Manfred about that, but I think he definitely wants to see, and I'm sure you know this, he wants to see starters going more innings. He thinks it's better for the game in terms of marketing. And obviously, the injuries have been a concern to him. So I think that's coming. And then I guess, kind of as you said, I mean, in terms of like recalibrating your pitchers, how tough a process is that to say, okay, look, you guys are going to have to start pitching 6, 7 innings. You're not going to be able to max out the velocity. We might have to reintroduce or rediscover the art of pitching like we've, maybe had seen more of 15, 25 years ago. That's got to be a multi-year process, I would think, to kind of all of a sudden start changing the pitching approach back to that level.
Yeah, I agree. It's going to take a while. And I think it's going to take some kind of rule change. And I don't know what that would be. I mean, there's a lot of talk of, making sure they have to have a minimum number of innings, for example. But, obviously if there was injury issues or um, other factors that would allow for a change, but um, maybe like a run differential, for example. So there's talk of a possible solution there, but I do think it has to start with a rules change, and then you'll see the behavior change.
Yeah, I get you. I get you. Okay. Um, Bill, there's been talk of adding two new MLB franchises for a total of 32 teams. Commissioner Manfred has said that he'd like to have a final decision in place by the time that he retires from MLB in January of 2029. Funny, when I interviewed Miami Heat president Eric Woolworth, he pushed back somewhat on the widely held expectations that the NBA would expand. His feeling was that some owners were not necessarily on board with sharing league revenues with two more owners, despite the near-term financial windfall that owners would see. What's your take on MLB expansion, and do you feel that this will likely happen?
Um, well, I think you pointed out there's pros and cons for owners. Obviously, an expansion fee is a short-term benefit to the existing teams. But that quickly gets spent and faded away. And then you have two more teams, um, dividing up the revenue sharing or media contracts or what have you, national revenue streams. And then it's just that much harder to compete or win the title when it's 1 out of 32 instead of 1 out of 30. Um, but look, it's a very popular sport. There are markets, I think, out there that still could support a team. But I'm sort of taking a wait and see approach. We don't want a new market to clip the fan interest or attendance from another market as well. So you have to be careful there. So on that issue, I'm kind of wait and see.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I know the commissioner feels strongly about it, but look, there's been some issues out there. I guess from your perspective, you don't think it's a definite that it happens within that time frame.
Well, I think there's a chance certainly, but there's like I think if in talking to Rob and I saw your interview with him, there's a lot to accomplish. I think before he wants to address that topic and see where the rest of the owners are. So I think the priorities right now are in other areas, and I agree with that. I think let's get through some of these hot topics and then you can kind of turn to expansion and see whether there's consensus among the ownership group.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I know he definitely said he wanted to get stadium issues set first before for the A's and the Rays before he moved into that. So we'll be following that in the next year or two. Let's talk a little regional TV. It's been reported that the Cardinals' local TV and streaming revenue this year will be about 58 million, which is down from an expected 78 million prior to the bankruptcy filing of regional sports network Diamond Sports. I don't know how accurate those numbers are or not. Commissioner Manfred has spoken about the possibility to nationalize all team local media rights in 2028, comparable to what the NFL does. I understand how difficult this could be given the large discrepancies in local media revenues between small market and large market teams. What are your thoughts on the potential for MLB to nationalize media rights?
Well, you're right. I mean, the trends haven't been good in local media recently. We are, for the first time, kind of experiencing that reset of our local media rights in 2025. And, probably half the teams, if you count them up, have experienced that, call it market correction, really driven by the cord cutting by a large number of households. It used to be that cord cutting was just kind of for like the, the college kids, and then they would kind of like steal a link from someone else's cable
Yeah.
subscription, right? Well, now it's become, with all the advent of streaming and all these other options, people feel like it's, you know, the way to go. And unfortunately, these legacy contracts from with the sports teams, particularly in baseball, hockey, and basketball, prevented us from really pivoting right away into a environment that allowed for both the linear cable subscriptions to be maintained, and then streaming products for those who have cut the cord. There was a delay in that, being able to respond to that trend because of legacy contracts. And we're a classic example of that. We would have loved to have a streaming product several years ago, but couldn't because of legacy stuff. Well, this year we will have one. So from a fan standpoint, actually, I think it's a positive development here this year, where um, anybody that can't get the games, or because they've cut the cord, or sometimes they still are cable subscribers, but their carrier has dropped the channel because they didn't want to pay the fees. In either case, they weren't getting access to the games, and now they have a direct to consumer option. And so that'll be out there for us, at least this year, which is great. It'll help our reach. We'll get to more fans. But it hasn't been good for us directly in terms of the revenue streams getting reset. I think this is happening throughout the industry. And over time, it's going to really affect every team. It already has started to affect every team, but not every team's felt the direct impact because they might be on a contract that's still holding on. But the other thing about that trend is that when you look at the half of the teams, if you will, that have experienced that reset, they tend to be the smaller and medium markets, not exclusively, but generally that's the case. Whereas the larger markets might have had a big RSN that's still hanging on or whatever. And so the revenue disparities that we've seen as a function of market size are getting exacerbated with this local media correction. And so I think that's sort of a subplot to this whole local media problem with MLB. But your question was then about, okay, do we support MLB sort of pulling all this together and resetting the whole economic landscape? And I would say certainly if, we're team players in MLB. I mean, if there's a better model to aggregate and consolidate, we're certainly all in on that. I think Commissioner has a real tough job. I mean, you've got to, sort of orchestrate this change where all these different contracts roll off at different times. And, you have national TV rights deals, you have local deals. What's the best relationship between national inventory and local inventory? And how do you create a new system of national and local TV rights for baseball that is ideal, given that we're sort of dealing with a crisis? So I think you don't never let a crisis go to waste, is a term you hear. And I think the commissioner is actually taking that philosophy and basically saying, all right, there is a big reset happening. How do we first deliver the right kind of product to fans? A, that's the most important. And B, how do we carve up all these rights and consolidate, if that's the way to make it work better, so that there's maybe a better way for the overall industry economics to work for every team.
Yeah, and when, obviously it's not an easy thing to do, right? I mean, I don't know, maybe the smallest regional package is, maybe somewhere 40, 50 million. And, I don't know. I remember when you look back at when the Dodgers signed their contract. I mean, if you just took the annual value of that, it was in excess of $300 million, So, I mean, that is really an amazing disparity, right? When you start looking at the largest markets and the smallest markets. And I could certainly understand the commissioner's vision, but boy, oh boy, you're talking some pretty big numbers on one end and somewhat lower numbers on the other end. Not an easy task by any means.
No, you're right. And it's fundamental to basically creating a level playing field. I mean, which, leagues at the end of the day have to have, um, a way for everybody to have a shot. I mean, it doesn't necessarily need to be a coin flip for every team, for every game, because that isn't really fun either. I mean, you kind of want an occasional dynasty. You want to see greatness. You want to see great teams, but you also want to see kind of at some point over a long period of cycle, everybody to be able to taste the winning formula. And that's what's good for the game. You can see it in other sports where there's parity, um, and everybody has a shot. I mean, that's really important for the integrity of a league. And so I think this media problem, if you want to call it that, is also an opportunity for baseball to rethink its media strategy and figure out a way for, um, first of all, like I said, for the fan experience to be better. I mean, we've had all these random blackouts in odd parts of the country because of legacy contract conflicts, and it just makes no sense. So cleaning all that up, allowing for everybody to watch whatever they want on any device, is an opportunity for baseball to kind of get it right in something that just evolved over time into a great product when everybody was on basic cable. In fact, as little as 5 or 6 years ago, there were 120 million people on basic cable. Now that's cut in half now, 50 or 60 by recent estimates. So we've got to figure out how to deliver the product in the right way to everybody, and then sort of let the chips fall economically from there, and up to the owners to figure out the best way to divide the pie.
I'll get you. All right. Yeah, I kind of had a few more questions along those lines. So, in the last year or so, we've seen a couple of huge player contracts in MLB. Shohei Ohtani signed for $700 million with the Dodgers, and recently the Mets signed Juan Soto for $765 million with no deferrals, the largest contract in the history of sports. Pretty amazing. The Dodgers have been up on a player signing tear and now have a projected 2025 payroll $374 million for competitive balance tax purposes. Incredibly, Hal Steinbrenner, Yankees owner, recently said it's difficult for most of us owners to be able to do the kinds of things that they're doing. We'll see if it pays off. It's the Yankees that said that. So you guys, you might be the perfect person to ask this question. The Cardinals are situated in the 19th largest television market out of 25. However, your organization has consistently punched above its weight. From 2000 to 2022, you've had 16 postseason appearances, and in that time, you made it to the World Series four times and won 2 World Championships. Bill, what do the huge contracts mean to your organization, and is it perhaps getting too difficult for small and mid-market teams to compete?
Well, I actually think those are slightly different issues in terms of, like, okay, first, my reaction to the contracts. Yeah, they're staggering in terms of their size. And, only the teams with the biggest revenues can kind of be in that stratosphere for the elite free agents. But I think that, teams tend to be generally fairly rational with their strategies as it relates to setting payroll and, trying to compete. I think teams at the bottom end of the pecking order realize that they can't do it every year because players who improve and get good and become superstars are going to walk in free agency. They just don't have the resources to sign them. So they develop their kids and they work hard on the draft, collect draft picks, whatever it is, to create a window of competitiveness. And then maybe they dip into the free agent pool to try to keep momentum going when they're on the right side of a cycle. The top markets, on the other hand, don't really need to think about the cycle, because as soon as a player underperforms or their system doesn't develop a player for a certain position, they just sign one in free agency. And so they don't really think about the cycle the way a small market team does, the competitive cycle and window, they can compete every single year by just throwing resources at their holes. We're sort of in the middle, like you mentioned. We are in a smaller market, but we punch above our market size because of the great fan support we have and great history and tradition. And we actually also have a pretty large secondary market, I'll call it, outside of St. Louis. If you drive a couple hundred miles in any direction, you're still in Cardinals country, and that outer market sort of adds up to sort of a secret weapon for us, that great legacy of KMOX and the westernmost team for so many years, Jack Buck and Harry Carey, and the winning teams and the tradition. That all that's to our advantage in terms of the strength of this outer market. And people in those outer markets come in and visit St. Louis and come to Cardinals games in the summer weekends and things like that. So it all nets out to us being kind of in the middle or upper middle of the league in revenues. Now, where does that put us in terms of a competitive cycle? Well, we had bucked that cycle for many, many years. I've had a competitive team, like you said, for 20 plus years. Right now, we're sort of experiencing a bit of a down cycle. We had a poor season 2 years ago. Last year, we were like 4 games over 500 and had higher expectations for our team than what happened on the field. And so we're kind of, I would say, have new appreciation for dealing with the cycle that other teams have had to deal with sometimes more than we have. But having said that, I think, our fans understand it, I believe. I mean, they know that we need to recommit to player development, to the draft, and make sure that when we are set from a young player standpoint and they're starting to improve and playing well, that once we're in that position, then we can add to some pieces that the system maybe doesn't create for you, here and there, 2 or 3 or 4 kind of spots, right? And that's when we can, I think, get back to where we're competing for championships again. But we can't just any hole that pops up, fill it with a free agent contract like the big markets. But we also have higher expectations than perhaps some of the tiny markets have, where they're just accepting of this limited cycle of competitiveness that they have to time perfectly. We feel like if we do our job right, we can have long competitive windows. But that you've got to have the foundation of the basics, which is drafting, player development, and being smart about how you run your organization.
Yeah, I guess the way things are set up right now, for small and mid-market teams, it's almost like, whether they want to hear it or not, the fans, I guess, have to be somewhat educated to say, this is just the reality of the game, right? I mean, most of these teams, I guess, just simply do not have the resources to go out and sign a player to a $600 or $700 million contract. And I know that's very frustrating for the fans to sit there and say, hey, just because I'm in, the Midwest, it doesn't mean that, my team should not have access to these players. So I definitely get that, there can be some frustration on the fan side, but, I saw you and your dad discussing, you're in the midst of your draft and develop cycle there. And, it certainly seems like you're in the midst of putting together a pretty good young core of players.
Yeah, I mean that's really been our strategy the last couple of years of well, I shouldn't say last couple of years because we really were giving it a shot to compete and try to win the division. Just didn't happen, and I think you can really get yourself in a pinch if you sort of overcommit and chase competitiveness when the foundation isn't there for it. And that's the last thing we want to do, because then that can create a spiral that lasts for an extended period of time. Just like a competitive window that you're sort of riding on an upward spiral, you can get into a downward spiral. We can't be in that position. Nobody wants to be in that position. We've seen teams that have unfortunately been there. And we just felt like if we started chasing it with big free agent contracts, that the foundation wasn't quite there to where that would leverage us and get us into the playoffs and make deep October runs. If doing that isn't going to push you over the edge, or is a very low probability of that working, then you've got to recalibrate and get back to the basics. And that's what we're doing. We want to make sure we've got, like you said, the fortunate thing is we don't have to strip the whole thing down. We've got really good young players. So let's see what they can do. And who knows, maybe it's this year they start to perform and we can, you know, add to what they've done for us with a trade deadline deal or something like that. But if they still need another year or two to develop, then, and we've got young draft picks coming, then that point at which you can really leverage that solid foundation is a little bit into the future, then that's what we have to accept. And it's not what fans necessarily always want to hear, but we would be doing them a disservice if we just chased it and found ourselves in a death spiral. The other thing I like to say is that what we're going through right now, if we end up successful in getting to where we want to be, which is consistently competitive teams in the playoffs and ultimately winning the World Series, it won't be in spite of what's happening to us right now. It will be because of it. And I think that's something that you really have to keep in mind, because it's a tough business, man. There's 30 teams trying to win that trophy every year, and they're trying their hardest, whether it's pushing the envelope on payroll or investing in player development or analytics or stadium operations. I mean, it's a multifaceted business with 30 competitive organizations. Nobody likes losing. I mean, let's be honest. I think some fans feel like certain owners maybe don't care, but I can assure you they all care, or they wouldn't be in this. They're just taking different strategies to get where they think they want to go. And there isn't just one path. There's not, depending on where you are in your market and in your stadium deal and whatever else, it dictates one path versus, there being an obvious cookie cutter approach to this.
Right. Yeah. So, that's a pretty good discussion of where we are. Let me ask you about where we may be going, because there's been an increasing talk of a league of haves and have-nots, and more commentary that the competitive balance tax is not creating balance in MLB. Commissioner Manfred responded recently to questions as to whether it's time for a salary cap, and he said, "This is an issue that we need to be vigilant on. We need to pay attention to it and need to determine whether there are things that can be done to allay those kinds of concerns and make sure we have a competitive and healthy game going forward." Bill, I guess, what a lot of fans are asking these days, is it time for a salary cap in Major League Baseball?
Well, look, I would echo what Rob said, which is that, we sort of have to look at everything. That's one issue in isolation of the overall economic system. I mean, there's so many elements to it, whether it's sort of minimum salaries, max salaries. I mean, you look at the other leagues, there are all sorts of mechanisms to create competitive balance. And, I'm a proponent of whatever system changes would create a more competitive, balanced situation. And but I wouldn't, want to just prescribe that, right now as to say, here's how it needs to happen. But there are lots of ways that we can get a system that works for everybody, including the players. I think, one of the things that the media likes to do is position the owners versus players as this kind of zero-sum game of chicken. And I don't believe that the solution to our issues is going to be solved in that manner. I think we have to approach it where the players are partners, which of course, they're the talent. They're what people come to see. And I think that we've got to get on the same page so that we can modify or change the system to create competitiveness and these cycles that can be more frequent for everybody. Um, you know, another way I would put it is that it feels like the system is benefiting some people very handsomely, and others in the system maybe aren't getting their fair share. And I would say that any changes that would um, spread the wealth a little bit more, I would be supportive of, both from a player standpoint and perhaps even an owner standpoint.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing, right? I mean, if we look at the NFL, and look, the Chiefs almost had an opportunity to win 3 Super Bowls in a row. So, I mean, they have been on a pretty good run, but pretty amazing to look and see what the Dodgers, the Yankees, and Mets are doing right now. And then you conversely, you look at the NFL and say, these guys can only all spend the same amount of money. It's a real contrast, and obviously it's worked out pretty well for the NFL. MLB, I guess, has not had, though, a repeat champion since 2000. I think the Yankees won it 3 years in a row there. So it is amazing. And maybe at the end of the day, this better than me. And, maybe the great equalizer in sports, even when you're spending a lot of money, is going to be injuries, right? I mean, there's nothing you can do. You can spend all the money in the world, but if you can't get those players healthy and on the field, so you never really know how it's all going to work out.
Yeah, injury is a big part of the variability of sports outcome. The other thing is just the nature of the sport. I mean, baseball is, I would call it slightly more random on a day-to-day basis in terms of the outcome than perhaps the other sports are. Um, you know, but that's why the long season is so valuable in baseball, because it kind of separates the contenders from the pretenders over a number of of months in the season, and 162 games. So, but you want the teams that qualify for the playoffs to have, reached that point through the long grueling season where you're dealing with injuries, you're dealing with managing a pitching staff, you're dealing with the ups and downs, winning streaks, losing streaks, and then at the end, the reward is that shot at the ring. And and even once you've gotten into the playoffs, it resets, and there's a certain amount of randomness as well, built into that system because of just the nature of the sport. But I feel like the teams, when you think about the regular season and that grind, that's what you're really trying to equalize, I think, and trying to make sure that there's competitive balance across 162 games for every team. There's only a fixed number of wins and losses. We know that. So how do you develop a system where those cycles of winning can kind of reach every market in a reasonable amount of time? I think that's the goal. How we get there is something that we need to have really good and constructive dialogue with the players about, because look, no player wants to be in a market that has no chance either. That's not doing the player any good. Sure, a few free agents might get giant paydays, but what does that do for the rank and file? Nothing really, if they're not benefiting from a chance to win as well. Everybody wants to win or have a chance through their career. So I'm supportive of a system that brings more opportunity for every player to experience that winning cycle over a reasonable amount of time, and obviously that translates to ownership and teams as well.
Yeah, yeah. All right, let's follow up on your, the talk about the players. A good source has indicated to me that the revenue split currently between players and owners is about 50-50. We consider the funds that MLB puts into the minor leagues. Historically, it's been a tough relationship between owners and the Players Association in baseball. However, to the credit of both sides, stoppages have been avoided and no games have been missed due to a work stoppage since 1994-95. I know that the commissioner feels that both sides are now equal partners, and it's in the best interest of all to figure out how to maximize revenues. Bill, in this period of record-setting player pay and soaring franchise values, is it time for a better relationship between the owners and the Players Association?
I certainly hope so. Yeah, I mean, look, I think what needs to happen is both sides need to walk in the other's shoes a little bit and understand what their concerns are. Um, Nobody wants to lose a negotiation. We get that. Um, and like I said before, I think we need a system that benefits everybody, owners, players, and fans, most of all, to be honest. So um, yeah, it's time. I mean, I think this cycle of CBA labor wars, I would love for that to come to an end. What I like to say is that when the players are your partners, and that's a loose term. I mean, you could think of it as let's just say like in other leagues where there's a guaranteed share of the pie that's promised to the players, and then there are all sorts of ways to um, um, enact that thesis or that theory. Um, when that occurs, I think you get really close to being in labor equilibrium, right? Because then it's not about, you know, grabbing from the same sized pie a bigger piece. It then becomes about, okay, look, we've established the ground rules here. How do we grow the pie together? And that's really where I'd love for us to get to. The details of how you get there are, for Rob and his team and the primary owners and player reps to figure out. But for sure, I'd love to get to that goal because when a league is in labor equilibrium, it will thrive.
Yeah, I mean, from an outsider looking in, the game itself, I'm not saying there's not issues, but I mean, just from a financial standpoint, right? You look at the player contracts, you look at the franchise values. Someone would just say, there's just no way, you could interrupt that. And I'm not saying it can't happen. We know that these things can happen, and I think the labor relationship in the NBA is gotten really good, and I think it's improved in the NFL. And I do think it's all because, the splits are getting so close. I think it is 50-50 in the NBA, not quite 50-50 in the NFL, but probably 48. And whether or not somebody on the player side would say, well, we're not sure it's 50-50, but, that's what I was told. But I think if you get everybody right who's on the same side, you would just think a lot of these bad feelings, and I know there's been a long history with the union. I guess you would just have to hope they would go away for everybody's benefit, right? I mean, everybody's making a fair amount of money here.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the statement. There's definitely some models out there that suggest that, and you're never gonna have a perfect system, but ones that both sides feel like um, this system is fair and that um, if they can come together to grow the sport, both sides will benefit equally in that growth. That's where you want to get to.
And I'm curious what it's like. And obviously, all relationships are different, but I mean, for the most part, an owner and his players, I mean, is that a comfortable relationship, where you go down in the field beforehand, the clubhouse, and, there's good feelings? Or does this really kind of permeate all the way down to the clubhouse where it's, hey, he's ownership and I'm labor? Or is there generally a good relationship between the players and the owners?
Yeah, well, I think there is. Yeah, on a club by club basis. I mean, can't speak for other clubs, but my sense is that some owners do a better job, I think, of relating to players and understanding what maybe their day-to-day needs are and how they can support what they're doing. Um, but for the most part, I don't think there's like any surface acrimony at all. I think it more happens at the um, just sort of the negotiating table among representatives in CBA talks. So, but no, I mean, look, this is why people come to games to see the superstars and the talent and, get that autograph from a player and, makes a kid's day, and that's why we're all in it. We're fans as well. I mean, I think that's something that people forget is like, yeah, there's a business aspect to this, but it's also just fun to be part of something that um, is sort of a iconic franchise in a city that people are coming here to have fun. And that's another big part of what I focus on, which is just like, the fan experience, coming to a game. What is that like? How does Busch Stadium um, handle the big crowds? How do they handle the little crowds? How do we make sure that everybody feels welcome here? It's clean, it's good food, it's reasonably priced. All those things are something that I think baseball has an advantage in because there's so many games. It's in the summer, it's outdoors. The nature of the game is one that you can have a conversation, and the tension of the game tends to build as the game progresses and as the season progresses. And it's something that people pass down through the generations, and you really feel that in baseball. Um, I would say perhaps more so than any other sport because of the nature of the game and the way that the stadium experience unveils or happens over the course of a season allows for this I think wonderful transfer of knowledge. There are all these like quirky rules in baseball. It's a very rules-based game, and teaching a young kid the rules and the strategy behind it, and trying to figure out, wait, what just happened and why did it happen, and all these things are nuances of baseball that should make us, I think, proud of the uniqueness of the sport. I love hockey. I play hockey. I root for the Blues, but it's just a different experience than what you would get in a summer baseball game outside in Busch Stadium. And we should celebrate that. What's different about that? Again, different from football, different from basketball. And I think St. Louisans have always appreciated that, which is why it's such a wonderful tradition to be a Cardinal fan and come to games. And it's just, there's something about it that I think is very special and unique. And like I said, I think that's what we should celebrate about the game of baseball.
Yeah, it's great. Let me just return to something you addressed a little bit earlier, because it's really amazing. And to be honest with you, I don't think many people realize this, but let me talk to you again a little bit about your fan attendance. After a tough 2023 season, the Cardinals saw a dip in attendance last year below 3 million fans. However, as you said before, your attendance number historically for a small to mid-market team have been amazing. The Cardinals have frequently been in the top 5 in home attendance, and many years have been second only to the Dodgers. You kind of gave us an overview before that, maybe your market is a little bit bigger than people think, but I mean, this is really just an amazing fan base that you guys have. I mean, those are big numbers.
Yeah, it's really good, and we appreciate it. One of the things that I like to say when talking to some other clubs and like industry meetings and things is that the nice thing about working for the Cardinals is that when you do something right, like a cool promotion or a neat idea for something at the ballpark or a winning team, whatever, the fans respond to that. I mean, there are some markets where like they've tried everything. It just hasn't quite moved the needle the way they'd hoped. In St. Louis, and I want to be clear, like we've come up with some dumb ideas too that haven't.
Yeah.
But that's kind of what it's all about, is trying to figure out what your market really values and what your fans really value. Winning most of all, I think, but the experience is a big part of it too, and the promotions and the family atmosphere. You also have to have a party atmosphere in certain areas and at certain times for the young crowd. And so I think, balancing all those different fan segments has been a priority for us and will continue to be. But Cardinals fans have been amazing. I mean, when you consider that there's a lot of people ask me, well, how have you been able to do it over the years? And it's kind of a 3 or 4-fold answer. One, the great winning tradition. I mean, we've won 11 world championships and 19 pennants, and seemingly every generation has had a championship to celebrate. You think about it, the Cardinals have won in the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, the 60s, the 80s, and the 2000s.
That's
The
really impressive.
banners in those decades. So it's become a generational celebration of that. We've talked about the market and the unique dynamics of the market. And just, I think, the tradition, being a Midwestern city where we're not like an East Coast, West Coast, where there might be a zillion things to do. I mean, of course, there's a lot to do here in St. Louis, but certainly on everybody's list is to come to a Cardinals game. So I think we have some inherent advantages based on our history and our winning tradition. And it's my job to kind of do what I can to keep that going, and try to think of new ways to make fans excited about coming down to Busch Stadium.
Yeah. I think, as you know, I interviewed Joe Buck a few months ago, and I realized just how special the relationship is between his family and the Cardinals organization. I read somewhere that from 1960 to 2008, there was at least one member of the Buck family on the Cardinals broadcast team, which is incredible. Jack is in the Cardinals Hall of Fame, and there was a bust statue of him outside the stadium. How special has this relationship been between the Bucks and the Cardinals over the years?
Yeah, well, I don't think anybody could have a greater ambassador than the Cardinals have had in Jack Buck over the years. You might put Stan Musial in that category, obviously from a ex-player standpoint. But I mean, just the way he connected with fans, his daily cadence of his voice, and how consistent he was, and just how like tuned into the Midwestern values and their love of the game and appreciation of the opposing teams and their stars and their players. It's just amazing. And then, of course, Joe was in the booth with us for many years as he was building his career, and then obviously went on to bigger and better things with an incredible broadcasting career that he's still in, but calling it, a couple dozen World Series and Super Bowls and US Opens, and I have fun with Joe. We see each other a lot in St. Louis, and do stuff together. So there's a really cool relationship there, and I always tell Joe, the door is open if you want to come back down to reality and back to your roots. You can always do a game. In fact, last year he did a game with Chip Carey, and he was, obviously grandson of legendary Harry Carey, who, along with Jack Buck, created probably the greatest play-by-play tandem of all time. And that was a very nostalgic game. The first one they were going to do got rained out, so they did they were just talking and doing stories and stuff. And then the remake game they were able to do, and Joe was like, geez, this game's moving faster with the pitch clock. I didn't have enough time to talk, but it's just fun to hear him tell the stories of his dad and how much the Cardinals meant to him, and obviously Joe grew up in this kind of like I did, and although he was younger when all that happened, and I think he really appreciates that connection that we try to maintain with him and his family.
Yeah, no, that's just a tremendous relationship. I'll just ask you really quickly, since you mentioned the pitch clock. You guys all in favor of how the game has been sped up, maybe about by a half hour or so over the last few years? All good with you guys?
Absolutely. I think it's been great for everybody in the system: owners, fans, players, even TV partners. I mean, the games are a little bit shorter by 30 minutes or whatever, but it's more predictable timing, and it's just a better pace of play. I mean, what's happened over the years is I think we all fell in love with a game that started to morph and change about 20, 30 years ago, gradually, because each team was pursuing its own self-interest with analytics and other changes, but nobody was looking at the overall game itself and whether each team doing it what was in its best interest was helping the fans in the broader scheme of things with the overall game. And so the pitch clock is a way of addressing that in some ways. And I think it was the absolute right move. And I'm supportive of almost all of the proposed changes that are designed to get more action in the game, um, and just more excitement and sort of back to the version of the game that we all fell in love with. Because that's really um, what's most important, is that the product itself is exciting and fun and captures the imagination of our fans.
Yeah, I think everybody would agree. It's been a big victory all around. Bill, thanks so much for joining us today on Questions for Cancer Research. I know how important it is for the Cardinals and all MLB owners in terms of the fight against cancer, which is awesome. We greatly appreciate your time and insight and wish you and the Cardinals all the best this season.
Thanks, Chris. Enjoyed it.